On a heavy June morning in 1940, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding stood alone in his office at RAF Bentley Priory, reading another memo questioning whether he was fit to command Britain's air defences. At 58, Dowding had become a quiet target inside Whitehall. Whispered doubts followed him through corridors. At Air Ministry meetings, the criticism was barely disguised. Britain was facing an existential threat, and many believed its survival rested in the hands of a man past his prime. The timing could not have been worse. France had collapsed with shocking speed. On June 22, 1940, the armistice was signed, leaving Britain utterly alone against Nazi Germany. Across the Channel, the Luftwaffe had perfected blitzkrieg air warfare. Poland's air force had been destroyed in days. France's in weeks. Hermann Göring commanded nearly 2,800 aircraft, flown by combat-hardened veterans fresh from conquering Western Europe. Fighter Command, by contrast, could barely muster 640 operational fighters. And leading that outnumbered force was a gray-haired officer critics privately called Stuffy, a nickname meant to mock his rigid, methodical approach to war. The doubts weren't entirely unreasonable. Aerial combat had changed beyond recognition since Dowding first flew during the First World War. In 1940, fighters screamed through the sky at 350 miles per hour. Messerschmitt Bf 109s could climb to 30,000 feet in minutes. Radar, radio control, and mass formations had transformed air combat into something brutally modern. Many inside the Air Ministry believed this new war demanded younger blood, men in their 40s who had grown up with wireless sets and instinctively understood modern technology. Dowding's retirement had already been postponed twice. First from June 1939 to March 1940. Then again to October. Each delay felt less like confidence and more like indecision, too risky to replace him, yet too uncomfortable to fully trust him. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, commander of 12 Group, made no secret of his ambition to take over. Younger, energetic, and outspoken, he promoted aggressive, big-wing tactics that sounded far more exciting than Dowding's cautious calculations. But what Dowding's critics failed to understand was that his apparent obsolescence was actually his greatest strength. While others dreamed of glorious dogfights over France, Dowding had spent 5 quiet years building something unprecedented. An integrated air defense system that treated radar, observers, fighters, and command centers as a single weapon. It wasn't glamorous. It involved endless meetings about telephone lines, plotting tables, and radio frequencies, the kind of administrative detail that made careers stall. But Dowding possessed 2 qualities Britain desperately needed. First, he understood that Britain could not win a war of attrition. Survival depended on fighting smarter, not harder. Second, he had a stubborn refusal to bend under pressure when he knew he was right. That stubbornness saved the RAF. In May 1940, as France collapsed, Winston Churchill demanded more fighter squadrons be sent across the Channel. Dowding refused. In a blunt letter, he warned that draining fighter command would guarantee Britain's defeat. Churchill was furious, but Dowding was right. Now, in the summer of 1940, every year of preparation was about to be tested. The foundation of Dowding's defense had been laid 5 years earlier, when radar was still dismissed by most officers as a laboratory curiosity. In February 1935, Robert Watson Watt demonstrated that radio waves could detect aircraft by bouncing signals off a bomber near Daventry. The Air Ministry reacted with polite skepticism. Weather would interfere. Enemy jamming would blind it. The equipment was too fragile. Dowding thought otherwise. As air member for research and later commander of the newly formed Fighter Command in 1936, he immediately recognized radar's true value: time. German bombers could cross the Channel in 20 minutes. Without warning, fighters would be caught on the ground. Radar could provide 30, or even 40, precious minutes. But Dowding wanted more than early warning. He envisioned something no nation had ever possessed: a real-time picture of the entire air battle. Chain-home radar stations would detect raids at long range. The Observer Corps, 30,000 civilian volunteers armed with binoculars and field telephones, would track aircraft once they crossed inland. Filter rooms would eliminate false contacts. Operations rooms at Bentley Priory would assemble the full picture, then pass it down to group and sector controllers. From there, fighters would be guided by radio, remotely steered onto enemy aircraft they could not yet see. Information flowed continuously, from radar tower to pilot's headset, in under 4 minutes. The challenges were immense. Radar towers stood 350 feet tall. Valves failed in coastal humidity. Early sets struggled to measure altitude. Dowding solved problems through relentless persistence, adding low-level radar stations, insisting on redundant telephone lines, and personally integrating civilian observers into a single reporting system. What emerged was revolutionary. For the first time in history, fighters became guided weapons, directed by controllers watching an electronic battlefield. To understand how Dowding's system truly worked, we need to follow a single German bomber from the moment it lifted off from northern France. That bomber's journey toward England would trigger a precise chain of responses, each step feeding the next, turning faint radio echoes into lethal interception. The first warning came from chain-home radar stations along the coast. Operators watched cathode ray tubes as bright spikes appeared, reflections of metal aircraft crossing the channel. Range was calculated by timing the echo. Bearing by comparing signal strength. Altitude, imperfectly, by vertical deflection. The operator didn't hesitate. He picked up the telephone and called the filter room at Fighter Command Headquarters. And that single phone call set Britain's entire air defense system into motion. That single phone call set the system in motion, but raw radar data alone was never enough. Early radar reports were notoriously unreliable. Flocks of birds could mimic aircraft. Coastal cliffs produced permanent echoes. Weather conditions created phantom contacts that appeared and vanished without warning. To prevent chaos, every report first passed through the filter room. Here, mathematically trained officers and WAAF plotters maintained a master chart of all activity. Each new contact was checked against existing tracks, tested with logic and timing, and judged either real or false. Only verified raids were assigned identification numbers. Only those confirmed plots moved forward. Within moments, the filtered picture appeared in Fighter Command's operations room at Bentley Priory, a vast hall dominated by a massive map of southern England and northern France. Around its edge, WAAF plotters moved colored counters every 30 seconds. Red marked enemy raids. Blue showed RAF fighters. Black indicated unknowns. Small triangular tags revealed freshness, sharp angles for new data, inverted triangles warning controllers when information had gone stale. From a raised gallery above the map, Dowding and his senior staff watched the battle form in real time. Their role was not to control individual dogfights. That was impossible. Instead, Dowding allocated resources across Fighter Command's 4 groups. If radar showed formations building over the channel toward Kent, he warned Air Vice Marshal Keith Park of 11 Group to prepare interceptions. At the same time, 12 Group under Lee Mallory was placed on standby to protect London and the Midlands if raids broke through. Actual interceptions were controlled one level down. At Group Headquarters, most famously Park's operations room at Uxbridge, controllers worked with identical plots. From there, orders flowed to sector stations, each responsible for roughly 40 miles of airspace. Sector controllers watched their own map tables and, when ordered to scramble, already knew exactly where the enemy was. As squadrons took off, blue counters tracked their progress using radio reports from formation leaders. Controllers guided them by voice. Constant heading and altitude corrections delivered over high-frequency radio. Tally-ho! Bandits at Angels 20. Vector 180. The system's first rail test came on July 10, 1940, the date later marked as the opening of the Battle of Britain. German formations attacked British convoys in the Channel, not to sink ships, but to lure Fighter Command into battle. The logic was simple. RAF fighters would be forced to engage over water, where downed pilots couldn't be rescued. Germany would win by attrition. Dowding refused to play along. When radar detected raids forming over Cap Gris-Nez, he ordered only minimal responses. A single squadron might make contact, then disengage before German numbers could overwhelm them. For long stretches, Controllers watched enemy aircraft circle convoys while British fighters stayed on the ground. Naval commanders were furious. Ships were being bombed while fighters remained at dispersal. Dowding did not move. Every Hurricane or Spitfire lost over the Channel meant a lost pilot forever. With only around 640 fighters against Germany's 2,800, arithmetic ruled everything. Saving shipping at the cost of fighter strength would leave Britain helpless when the invasion came. His system gave him something Germany lacked: the freedom to choose when and where to fight. In early August, the Luftwaffe changed tactics and attacked the system itself. On August 12, Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers struck radar stations along the Kent coast. Ventnor on the Isle of Wight was badly damaged, leaving a 70-mile gap in coverage. German intelligence believed Britain had been blinded. They were wrong. Observer corps posts filled the gap visually. Engineers erected temporary aerials broadcasting fake signals to deceive German listeners. Filter rooms rerouted data from neighboring stations, maintaining a degraded but functional picture. The system bent, but it did not break. On August 13th, Adlertag, Eagle Day, Göring launched the offensive meant to destroy Fighter Command. Nearly 1,500 sorties targeted airfields across southern England. Bombs cratered runways and destroyed hangars. But German intelligence had made a fatal mistake. They attacked forward landing grounds like Manston and Hockenge, useful but not vital. The true nerve centers, Biggin Hill, Kenley, Nordholt, remained largely intact. The Luftwaffe was smashing shop windows while the machinery in the backroom kept running. 2 days later, on August 15th, Germany mounted its largest single-day assault. Raids came from 3 directions. Luftflotte 5 attacked from Norway, convinced northern England lay beyond RAF reach. Dowding's operations room tracked every squadron status: available, engaged, refueling, or resting. This relentless bookkeeping revealed his greatest strength: unsentimental mathematics. While politicians spoke of spirit and defiance, Dowding calculated fatigue rates, replacement numbers, and the minimum force needed to make invasion impossible. His conclusions were often unwelcome, but they were correct. That same cold logic had saved Britain back in May, when Churchill promised France more fighters. Dowding confronted the War Cabinet with numbers, not rhetoric. Fighter Command needed 52 squadrons. Britain had 39. Sending more would doom them both. Churchill was furious, but he relented. Now, in August 1940, that decision was paying dividends. Even so, the margins were razor-thin. Aircraft production barely matched losses. Pilots did not. Squadrons flew 3 or 4 sorties a day with shrinking numbers. Dowding rotated exhausted units north, replacing them with rested squadrons. Lee Mallory protested fiercely. Dowding stood firm. A shattered squadron was worse than none at all. He was not managing today's battle, but 50 tomorrow's. On Sunday, September 15, 1940, Chain Home detected massive formations assembling over the Pas-de-Calais. At Bentley Priory, Dowding watched red markers flood the map. The raids came in waves. By late morning, Park scrambled every available squadron. 23 squadrons, over 250 fighters, were airborne at once. The largest force Fighter Command had ever assembled. Controllers guided them with precision. Hurricanes engaged escorts. Spitfires tore into bomber formations. The system Dowding had built over 5 years was fighting for Britain's survival. That morning, Winston Churchill stood in Uxbridge's operations room, watching the counters turn red, one after another. Finally, he turned to Keith Park and asked the question Britain had feared for months. "What other reserves have we?" Park didn't hesitate. "There are none." There were no reserves. And yet, the system held. German bomber formations, harassed continuously from the moment they crossed the Channel, began to break apart. Bombs meant for airfields and docks fell uselessly across the Kent countryside. Some crews jettisoned their loads early, desperate to escape. Others pushed on toward London, but arrived scattered, disorganized, stripped of the tight formations required for accuracy. Dowding's insistence on intercepting raids as far from their targets as possible had worked. Most bombers never reached their aiming points at all. For German crews, the psychological shock was devastating. They had been told the RAF was finished, exhausted, depleted, hanging by a thread. Instead, they encountered fighters at 20,000 feet, then more at 15, then yet more climbing to meet them as they turned for home. It felt endless. That afternoon, the Luftwaffe returned with even greater force, over 150 bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters. This time, Dowding coordinated both 11 Group and Lee-Mallory's 12 Group, allowing the much-debated Big Wing to form. 5 squadrons rose together in a massive formation. To German aircrews already shaken by the morning, it appeared as if the entire RAF had taken to the sky. To German aircrews already shaken by the morning, it appeared as if the entire RAF had taken to the sky. British pilots filed wildly inflated victory claims. 185 enemy aircraft destroyed. The real number was 56. But the truth mattered less than perception. Luftwaffe crews returned convinced they had faced 300 or 400 British fighters. German intelligence had estimated Fighter Command possessed barely 200 serviceable aircraft. On September 15, 1940, that assumption collapsed. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. Intelligence reports confirmed what German crews already knew: Fighter Command was not broken. Attempting an invasion without air superiority would be suicidal. The Battle of Britain did not end overnight. Bombing continued into autumn and the Blitz followed. But the existential threat was gone. Britain had survived. Dowding's reward was dismissal. On November 17, 1940, barely 2 months after Fighter Command's greatest triumph, the Air Ministry informed him he was being replaced. Air Marshal Sholto Douglas would assume command. Dowding was offered a minor liaison role in America. Exile, politely disguised. No ceremony. No public thanks. Less than a day's notice. The knives had been drawn weeks earlier. Under the cover of tactical debates, Dowding's critics, led by Lee-Mallory and supported by Douglas Bader, attacked his defensive strategy, claiming the Big Wing could have destroyed the Luftwaffe entirely. The argument ignored reality. Big Wing formations took 20 to 30 minutes to assemble. By the time they reached altitude and crossed south, bombers had often already struck and turned for home. Park's 11 Group squadrons scrambled quickly from coastal sectors, intercepted raids exactly as Dowding intended, early, repeatedly, relentlessly. The Big Wing impressed when it arrived in time, but functioned better as a psychological weapon than a reliable defense. Politics decided the rest. The Air Ministry had long resented Dowding's independence, his demands for radar funding, his refusal to waste fighters in France, his habit of questioning orders. Now that Britain was safe, scores were settled. Officially, he was dismissed for age. Unofficially, for personality. Dowding was stubborn, awkward, and uninterested in politics. He made enemies, and wars give enemies opportunity. Keith Park soon followed him out, removed from 11 Group and sent to obscurity. Lee-Mallory replaced him. The men who had actually won the Battle of Britain were gone. Dowding spent the rest of the war sidelined. He retired in 1942, granted a peerage that felt more like a quiet dismissal than an honor. Others claimed credit. Vindication came slowly. Post-war analysis revealed the truth Dowding had understood instinctively. German morale was collapsing. Bomber losses, around 4% per mission, were unsustainable. Göring's claims that the RAF was nearly finished were catastrophically wrong. Had Dowding squandered his fighters early, or committed fully to slow-forming mass tactics, Fighter Command would likely have collapsed by September. Instead, his system endured. Other nations learned the hard way. American air defenses in the Pacific struggled until they adopted centralized control modeled on Fighter Command. The Soviets suffered catastrophic bombing until they implemented filtered plotting systems based on Dowding's design. By the Cold War, every serious air defense network followed the same principles. Early warning, centralized filtering, real-time coordination, ground-controlled interception. NORAD was Dowding's system, scaled to a continent. Modern defenses, from Aegis to Iron Dome, still follow the architecture he created. The technology has changed. The idea has not. Sir Hugh Dowding died on February 15, 1970, at the age of 87, having lived long enough to see the world adopt the system he built in silence. In 1940, Britain doubted whether a 58-year-old could defend the nation with untested technology. That 58-year-old didn't just save Britain. He changed warfare forever.